Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Cassie never believed in grand suspicions. She wasn't the kind of woman who ransacked her husband's phone or picked quarrels over perfume scents left in the air. Instead, she paid attention to the unspoken things, the way silence lingered longer after dinner, the way Leonard answered questions with a nod even when a word would have sufficed, the way his shirt collars began returning home, more crisply ironed than when she sent them out. 9 years had taught her that love didn't end in one big explosion. It evaporated slowly, like steam leaving hot yam. And yet she stayed. She stayed even when Leonard forgot her birthday, even when she cried in the bathroom and lied that it was her allergies. They'd met as young professionals, struggling to find their feet in a bustling city that neither cared nor waited. Cassie was always the grounded one, the one who planned ahead, saved receipts, remembered names. Leonard used to adore that about her. He called her his balance, his sweet reminder to breathe. But people change, or perhaps masks fall off. By the time Cassie lost her job in the finance sector after a mass layoff, she knew Leonard had emotionally drifted so far she couldn't hear his footsteps anymore. He didn't hug her that day, didn't even look up from his phone. Just said, "You'll be fine," like someone reciting a line from an overplayed movie. That evening, she stared at her reflection for hours, not crying, not angry, just blank, as if waiting for a sign that hadn't yet arrived. The days that followed were slow, heavy with silence, and padded with small betrayals she couldn't prove but still felt. Cassie started waking earlier than usual, partly out of habit, partly to avoid sharing the same bathroom space with Leonard. He had begun closing the door when she entered, something he never used to do. Once, while folding laundry, she found a receipt for a fancy rooftop dinner, 2 meals, expensive wine, and a dessert she had never tasted in her life. The date on the slip was the same night he told her he had a late meeting at Ancha's office. She didn't confront him. Instead, she folded the paper in 4, slid it into her journal, and continued folding shirts as if she hadn't discovered anything. It was easier that way. Her sister had told her once that some marriages didn't die, they just fell asleep with their eyes open. Cassie understood now, and yet something inside her refused to sink. A friend from church, Sheila, reached out during one of those quiet afternoons. Sheila had recently been promoted at Kingston Properties, a real estate firm that specialized in luxury homes. She offered to teach Cassie the ropes. "You have the grace and composure for this work," Sheila had said, her voice crisp with certainty. Cassie almost laughed. Her selling houses? But something about starting over, even quietly, appealed to her, and so she began training under Sheila, learning how to close deals, handle clients, and walk into expensive homes without feeling small. She told no one, not even Leonard. It wasn't secrecy. It was survival. Leonard, on the other hand, felt no such emotional weight. In his mind, Cassie was simply tired and adjusting. He had never been the most observant husband, but lately he didn't even pretend to be. He'd long convinced himself that his marriage had grown cold, functional, and past its best before date. Mira came into his life like a hot breath on frosted glass, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. He met her at an expo, where she sold imported household decor and moved like a woman who had already chosen her future. Her charm wasn't in how she looked, but in how she spoke. Bold, confident, almost aggressive in her admiration. Leonard, who hadn't heard a compliment in months, fell easily into her net. He told her he was separated, used phrases like "in transition" and co-parenting emotionally. Mira didn't pry. She only asked for gestures, for weekends away, for small indulgences that felt bigger than they were. Eventually, she said she wanted her own house, somewhere she could call hers, where Leonard wouldn't have to explain himself. He liked the sound of it. He was already thinking of his future like a clean slate. Cassie never came up in conversation, not even as a memory. That's how removed he felt, how detached he had become. By the time he reached out to Carson's firm and scheduled a viewing through one of their junior agents, he didn't think twice about it. All he wanted was a discreet process, a quiet purchase, something smooth and tidy, like Mara's French perfume. The irony was that Cassie had no idea who the client was when Sheila handed her the file. "Big fish," Sheila said with a smile. "Let this be your first closed deal. You deserve it." Cassie took the manila folder, flipped through the client notes, and memorized the name scribbled in half-legible ink, Mr. Leonard Idef. It didn't click at first. Idef wasn't a rare surname. In fact, she'd once worked with 3 different Idefs at the bank. But something tugged at her as she scanned the attached number, familiar yet impossible to place. Still, she brushed it off and focused on the job. The house she was to show was a modern 2-story property in Elms Grove Estate, a creamy 4-bedroom beauty with glass balconies and solar backup. The kind of place she and Leonard once dreamed of owning together back when love still had legs. Cassie arrived an hour early to prepare, dusting light switches, spraying lavender air freshener, and setting the viewing folder on the marble counter. She wore a soft blue blouse and a brown pencil skirt, her hair tucked into a simple knot. The moment the knock came at exactly 2 p.m., she composed herself, slipped on her client-ready smile, and opened the door. Then everything stopped. Standing before her was Leonard, hand resting gently on the waist of a tall woman in a gold dress. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. Mira blinked. Leonard froze. The key Cassie held in her hand remained wedged in the lock, but the door to everything they once were, that one had already swung wide open. The silence that followed that unexpected reunion at the doorstep was the kind of silence that rearranged the temperature of a room. Cassie stood there like a statue freshly chiseled from disbelief, her grip on the key no longer about professionalism, but something far more instinctive, like holding on to the last piece of truth she could physically clutch. Leonard, whose mouth had opened halfway as if to speak, stood immobilized, his shoulders tight with the kind of tension that suggested his mind was struggling to construct an explanation even his mouth wasn't ready to carry. And then there was Mira, oblivious but intrigued, peering past Cassie into the house with a confident smile that could only come from someone who believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. "It's lovely from the outside," she said, brushing past Cassie without waiting for permission, her heels clicking against the tiled entryway like punctuation marks in a story that had taken a wrong turn. Cassie stepped aside mechanically, her heart knocking inside her chest like a trapped bird in a glass room. Leonard followed Mira in, but his steps were awkward, the usual assurance in his gait smothered by the weight of recognition. He glanced at Cassie only once, and in that glance was a silent request, a plea not to speak, not to collapse everything right there in the hallway. She offered him nothing back. Not a word, not a smile. Only the sound of her heels echoing as she walked behind them, suddenly unsure whether this was still her job or just a private viewing of betrayal in broad daylight. Cassie moved through the house like a ghost in her own skin. Her voice, trained and practiced during weeks of estate agent orientation, now sounded like someone else's words falling from her lips. "As you can see, the property offers a spacious open-plan living room," she said, her tone composed, her eyes deliberately avoiding Leonard. Mira smiled politely, asking questions that barely reached Cassie's ears. "Is this marble flooring or ceramic? Do the windows come double-glazed? Can I repaint this wall if I want a warmer tone?" With each inquiry, Cassie responded as if reading from a prompt card, her brain and mouth moving in tandem, but her heart still stuck at the front door where her marriage had unraveled like poorly sewn lace. Leonard didn't speak. He trailed behind, occasionally pretending to study the fixtures, but his eyes remained glued to the ground. The entire house felt haunted, not by spirits, but by secrets, every room echoing with the irony that a man had brought his mistress to a property his wife had been assigned to sell. Cassie took them through the kitchen, pointed out the solar inverters, led them up the floating stairs that creaked softly with each footstep. On the landing, she paused before the master bedroom. Something inside her hesitated, not from professionalism but pain. That room, with its wide bay windows and soft beige curtains, had reminded her of a Pinterest board she once saved on her phone titled Future Home. She had shown it to Leonard years ago. He had nodded and said, "We'll get there." And now, here she was, leading him into that vision, while another woman imagined herself living inside it. The tour ended without fanfare. Mira turned to Leonard and said, "I love it. It feels like us." The phrase, so casually spoken, landed on Cassie like a slap that came with a smile. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked toward the kitchen counter and placed the folder down, the folder that contained the blueprint, financials, and terms of the property. "Mr. Adafe," she said quietly, finally allowing their eyes to meet, "you can go over these documents and return them signed to our head office or send them through the contact listed there." She didn't blink, didn't fold, didn't shout. Mira took the folder with a grateful nod and said, "Thanks, Cassie. You're very professional. You must really love what you do." That comment, so ignorant and innocent, might have broken someone else, but for Cassie, it only added another brick to the wall she was quietly building inside herself. "I try," she replied with a smile that never reached her eyes. As they walked out, she remained behind, waiting for the sound of the gate to close before collapsing into the nearest chair. Her breath came in short bursts, her palms pressed against her thighs as if anchoring her body to the present. She didn't cry. That would have given the moment too much permission. Instead, she just sat there, blinking at the tiled floor, wondering how a person could feel everything and nothing at the same time. She thought of calling Sheila, thought of quitting the job, but then reminded herself that she needed this for more than money. She needed it to remember who she was before her life became someone else's side story. Leonard didn't drive home with Mira after the visit. He told her he had errands to run, though she could tell something was off. "You didn't even ask about the kitchen fittings," she teased lightly. He smiled, but it was tight, like fabric stretched too far. Once Mira was dropped off at her place, Leonard parked a street away and sat alone in his car, trying to breathe through the chaos playing ping-pong inside his chest. Cassie had said nothing to expose him, had acted like a stranger. That silence unnerved him more than any confrontation could have. He expected screaming, tears, accusations. He expected a reaction that would allow him to respond, to justify, to fight. But Cassie gave him none of that. She gave him quiet, a polished, deliberate quiet that forced him to sit alone with himself. He remembered the first time he saw her years ago, holding a mop in their first apartment, humming to herself after a long day at work. She'd looked up at him and smiled. That smile used to be his anchor, and now it was gone. He hadn't even realized how far he drifted until she opened that door and didn't crumble. Instead, she stood tall, key in hand, not just unlocking a house, but quietly locking him out of something she once gave freely, her presence. And now he wasn't sure how to get back in, or if she would ever leave the door open again. Cassie spent the next several days walking through the motions of work like a woman whose body had returned, but whose soul remained stuck somewhere between a tiled living room and the sound of a familiar voice calling someone else babe. She didn't speak to Sheila about what had happened, didn't explain why she skipped lunch breaks or why her usually neat handwriting became jagged on the daily logs. Instead, she showed up early, stayed late, and volunteered to handle cold clients no one else wanted. The office became a strange sort of sanctuary, not because it brought her joy, but because it distracted her from the ache she hadn't found a name for. She avoided her phone like it owed her money. Leonard hadn't called. She hadn't texted. At night, she lay on the farthest end of the bed, eyes wide open, heart whispering questions she was too tired to answer. There were no arguments, no apologies, just silence, like two tenants occupying the same house with invisible borders drawn across the tiles. She cooked less, spoke only when necessary, and nodded when he mentioned things like, "I'll be late," or "I'm heading out." Every time he stepped out of the house, she wondered if he was going to see Mira, and every time he returned, she wondered what story he told to excuse the lipstick that wasn't hers. But still, she said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she needed time. Time to understand if what had happened at the house that day was the end, or simply the exposure of something that had already died quietly under their roof. Leonard, on the other hand, had never been more confused. The guilt that followed him after that house viewing clung to his skin like smoke, even when he tried to act like nothing had happened. Mira had noticed his change almost immediately. She became colder, more inquisitive, and subtly demanding in ways that pressed against his already fraying nerves. "You haven't called me baby in days," she said one evening, pouting beside him in the car. "Are you bored of me already?" Leonard smiled weakly and kissed her hand, but the motion felt rehearsed, forced. He was thinking of Cassie, of how she didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't embarrass him. That composed silence had followed him like a shadow, louder than any slap could have been. He began remembering things he hadn't thought about in years, how she used to iron his shirts inside out, how she always laid out his keys with his wallet before bed, how she used to fall asleep holding the edge of his shirt like a child afraid of losing her favorite blanket. Suddenly, her absence from his daily rhythm began to feel like grief. He found himself staring at the living room wall longer than usual, scrolling through old photos on his phone just to hear her laugh again, even if just in a memory. When she walked past him in the hallway now, he caught himself wanting to apologize, to explain, to rewind. But the words died in his throat every time because he knew sorry would never be enough. He also knew that saying it wouldn't guarantee she'd ever look at him the same way again. Meanwhile, Cassie was preparing for another house showing when Sheila pulled her aside in the hallway. "That client from last week, the one with the gold-dressed girlfriend. Is everything okay?" Sheila's voice was calm but curious. Cassie paused, the clipboard in her hand feeling heavier than usual. "Why do you ask?" Sheila tilted her head. "Because I've known you for years, and your smile hasn't touched your eyes all week. I saw the tension. I also know what a woman looks like when she's holding back a flood just to stay composed." For a moment, Cassie considered brushing it off, but instead, she surprised even herself when she nodded slowly and whispered, "He's my husband." Sheila's eyebrows lifted, mouth parting in a soft gasp. "You're joking." Cassie shook her head. "I wish I were." A long silence fell between them. Then Sheila reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "You handled that like a queen, Cass. I don't know how you kept your head up." Cassie blinked back to tears threatening to rise. "Because if I didn't, I would have drowned in the middle of the tour." Sheila smiled sadly and said, "You don't have to pretend with me. You're allowed to break, just not permanently." That evening, Cassie stayed back in the office and wrote a letter, not to Leonard, but to herself. A letter reminding her that silence didn't mean weakness and composure wasn't surrender. That sometimes the quietest women carried the loudest truths, and that maybe healing wasn't something someone gave you. It was something you took back when you were finally ready. Leonard finally decided he couldn't stay numb any longer. One evening, while Cassie was folding laundry on the couch, he approached her with a hesitant breath and stood a few feet away like a boy waiting to be scolded by a principal. "Cassie," he began, voice rough from overthinking, "I want to talk." She didn't pause. She didn't look at him. She simply continued folding a plain bedsheet and replied, "I'm listening." That single phrase was both an invitation and a warning. Leonard sat slowly, hands clasped between his knees. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Mira, she was a mistake. I think I got caught up in something I didn't understand." You understood enough to hold her waist while I held a key to a house you wanted to give her. Leonard flinched. I was wrong, he said. I don't know how to fix it, but I'm sorry. Cassie inhaled deeply and looked away. You didn't come to me the day it happened. You didn't come home with honesty. You let me carry it alone while you buried your guilt in silence. And now, because I didn't scream or cry, you think sorry is enough. Leonard's throat tightened. What do you want me to do? He asked. Cassie folded the last shirt and stood. I want you to leave me alone, just long enough for me to remember who I was before I spent years trying to be enough for someone who never saw me. She walked into the bedroom and closed the door softly. No slam. No raised voice. Just the echo of a woman reclaiming her space, one room at a time. The following week, Cassie walked into the Kingston Properties office wearing a rust-colored dress that kissed her knees and modest black heels that made no noise as she moved. She had straightened her hair that morning, not for anyone in particular, but because she wanted to look like the version of herself that once smiled in the mirror without second-guessing. Sheila noticed the shift. You look radiant, she said with a knowing glance. Cassie responded with a soft smile, the kind that hinted at a woman who had bled and bandaged herself privately. Carson, the firm's lead broker and Sheila's direct boss, called for a quick morning meeting. The firm had just acquired 2 new luxury properties in Eastview Crescent, and Carson announced that one of them had already drawn interest from a repeat client. Mr. Edifie, he said casually, flipping through his iPad, the man who viewed that Elms Grove house last week. He wants to schedule a new viewing, different location, slightly lower budget. Says he wants something quieter, more subtle. The room didn't flinch, but Cassie's heart rolled into her throat. Sheila glanced at her immediately, her brows drawing together. Carson looked up. Cassie, you've handled him before. You good to take this one again? The pause that followed was microscopic, but it held an entire conversation. Cassie nodded once. Yes, sir. I can manage it. Carson nodded, already scrolling past her. The room dispersed slowly, and Sheila pulled her aside. Are you sure? Cassie's eyes didn't waver. Let me handle it. This time, I choose the key. Leonard hadn't expected to see Cassie again. Not in that context. Not so soon. He assumed Kingston Properties would assign another agent after the awkwardness of their last encounter, but when he stepped into the viewing house at Eastview Crescent, he found her there, standing near the window with a clipboard in hand, her posture tall, her expression unreadable. The property was a modest 3-bedroom bungalow with an inner courtyard and a clean, tiled foyer that smelled faintly of lemon polish. He hadn't brought Mira this time. In fact, he hadn't spoken to Mira in 3 days. Their last conversation had ended with her asking, "You still in love with your wife?" and him replying with silence so loud it sounded like a confession. Seeing Cassie again brought back everything, her calm, her restraint, the grace she carried even when humiliated. "Hi," he said awkwardly, stepping inside. "Thanks for coming," she said evenly, not smiling, but not unkind either. "I'll walk you through." The tour was brief but thorough. She described each space with clarity, pointing out details he might miss: natural light, layout potential, water pressure, neighborhood access. He followed her like a man tailing his own guilt. When they reached the back patio, she turned and faced him. "Why this place?" she asked. Leonard looked down. "It's quiet. Feels like it doesn't expect too much." Cassie blinked slowly. "Houses don't have expectations, Leonard. People do." He nodded, ashamed. "I deserve that." She didn't reply. She handed him the folder and stepped aside. "The documents are in there. If you decide to proceed, you'll work directly with Mr. Carson from here on out." He hesitated. "Cassie," she raised a hand, silencing him gently. "This isn't about what you need anymore. It's about what I'm choosing not to carry." That night, Cassie returned home before sunset. The air was soft with the scent of hibiscus blooming in the compound garden, and somewhere in the distance a neighbor's child laughed as his mother called him in for dinner. She stood by the window and watched the world carry on, unaware of her heartbreak, unaffected by her inner storm. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel not just anger or betrayal, but grief for the version of herself that once believed love could protect you from loneliness. She thought about packing up, moving out, starting fresh, but something inside her whispered that running wouldn't heal what silence had already begun to mend. Instead, she poured herself a glass of warm water, sat on the couch, and opened her journal. She flipped past the pages where she'd once written hopeful lists, vacation plans 2020, baby names, anniversary dinner ideas, and turned to a blank page. There, she wrote 3 words in small, deliberate letters. My life matters. Not in comparison to anyone. Not as a reaction, but as a declaration. Her phone buzzed. A message from Leonard. Thank you for today. I know you didn't have to. She read it twice before locking the screen and placing the phone face down. She didn't reply. She wouldn't reply. Some messages don't deserve answers. They deserve silence, the kind that protects, the kind that preserves dignity like fine china too sacred to be touched after being chipped by careless hands. Meanwhile, Leonard sat in his parked car outside his old friend Jude's place, staring into nothingness while the house glowed faintly with evening lights. He didn't go inside. He hadn't told anyone about the fallout with Cassie. To his friends, he still played the composed husband, the man who had things under control. But the truth was messier than he had the words for. He hadn't expected to lose Cassie, not truly. He thought she might scream, cry, maybe even leave for a few days, but he never imagined she'd stay and grow distant with such terrifying resolve. That distance gnawed at him. It made him reflect in ways he'd long postponed. He thought about every time he'd brushed off her needs, every time she came home with stories and he responded with one-word answers. He remembered the way she used to wait up for him and how he never noticed when she stopped. The silence she now carried wasn't passive, it was powerful. It reminded him that consequences weren't always loud. Sometimes they whispered, slowly removing themselves from your life one layer at a time until you woke up alone, wondering how you lost someone who used to give you everything without you having to ask. And maybe, just maybe, that was the punishment he had earned, not her anger, not her revenge, but her absence in the very spaces he once assumed she'd always occupy. Cassie didn't expect to rise so quickly through Kingston Properties, but something about the way she carried herself, even in the face of personal chaos, caught the attention of Mr. Carson and a few influential clients who had been quietly observing her. When he called her into his office one rainy Thursday afternoon, she thought it was about a clerical error or a missed follow-up, but instead he handed her a leather-bound folder and said, "Cassie, I want you to take the lead on our mid-year showcase event. It's a big deal. You'll be representing us to the top-tier buyers, developers, and media houses. You've earned it." She blinked at him, unsure if she'd heard right. "Me?" she asked, as though her name didn't sound familiar coming from a compliment. He chuckled. "Yes, you. You've held this place down quietly. With dignity. That matters more than people realize." She left the office in a daze, not because she didn't believe she was capable, but because it had been so long since someone affirmed her without obligation or expectation. That night, she boiled yam and made a simple pepper sauce. She ate slowly, alone, and in silence, not from sadness, but from peace. Something was shifting inside her. Not a scream. Not a bang. But a soft unfurling of wings she didn't know she still had. She didn't share the news with Leonard. Some victories, she'd decided, needed to live quietly within you before anyone else had a chance to misplace them. Leonard's world, however, was folding in on itself. Mira had stopped calling. After their last dinner ended with her pushing her plate aside and asking, "Do you think you're a good man?" He hadn't known how to respond. "I think I tried," was all he managed to say, and she had simply nodded, stood up, and walked away without finishing her food. That moment stayed with him. Not because she left, but because for the first time, he began to see how many people he had hurt simply because he was too entitled to question himself. Now, the silence in his home felt louder. He and Cassie still shared the same roof, but she no longer moved around him the way she once did. Her body language no longer asked permission, sought approval, or bent in service. She walked into the room, took what she needed, and walked out without ceremony. She existed like the last line of a poem, complete, unbothered, uninterested in edits. And strangely, Leonard found himself admiring her again. He started noticing her again, the way her neckline framed her strength, the calm pace of her voice during work calls, the way she hummed when she didn't know she was being observed. But it wasn't the admiration of a man who wanted his wife back. It was the realization of someone who had already lost her in every way that counted. And now he was watching the part of her he had taken for granted rise without him. And that, more than guilt, was what began to ache inside him. The showcase arrived on a breezy Saturday morning, and Cassie arrived early, her name stitched in gold on a black name badge that felt heavier than jewelry. She wore a fitted forest green dress and a low bun, her heels clicking confidently as she moved from tent to tent, greeting guests, exchanging cards, explaining listings like a woman who had always belonged in this world, but had only now been handed the microphone. Carson stood at a distance more than once, arms folded proudly, watching her charm developers who wouldn't have taken a second look at her 6 months ago. Cameras clicked. Reporters asked for interviews. At one point, a woman from City Life magazine tapped her on the shoulder and said, "You don't just sell houses. You sell calm." Cassie smiled softly. "I try to sell more than square meters. I try to sell the feeling that maybe you found a place that won't betray you." The woman blinked slowly. "That's a quote. I'm using that." As the sun dipped lower, casting gold across the estate's rooftops, Leonard appeared. He hadn't been invited, but he knew the event location. His company had printed the flyers. He stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her speak to a group of clients. He didn't approach. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, and for the first time in years, he saw her not as his wife, or as the woman he'd disappointed, but as someone he no longer recognized. Not because she'd changed too much, but because she had grown into a version of herself that had nothing to do with him. When the event wrapped up and the guests filtered out, Cassie remained behind to help the cleanup team gather brochures and fold chairs. She didn't need to, but she wanted to. She liked ending things well. As she stepped out into the compound, Leonard finally approached her. She looked up, not startled but unsurprised. "You shouldn't be here," she said plainly. He nodded, hands in his pockets. "I know. I wanted to see you." She exhaled. "You already have." A beat passed. "Cassie, I've been thinking a lot," he said slowly. "I don't expect anything from you. I just need you to know I've been wrong in more ways than I understood." She nodded. "I know. And if there's ever a version of this life where you can forgive me, I hope I live long enough to see it." She didn't soften, didn't crumble. She simply looked at him with clear eyes. "Forgiveness isn't the issue, Leonard. I forgave you weeks ago. The issue is restoration. And some damage can't be undone, not because I'm bitter, but because I've healed differently now." She stepped past him, her bag over her shoulder, her heels firm on the gravel. He turned as she walked away, and for the first time, he understood something deeply. Forgiveness isn't always a door that leads back. Sometimes it's a gate that opens only one way forward. Cassie moved out of the house quietly on a Wednesday morning while the city was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. She'd already signed the lease for a small apartment tucked inside a serene corner of Bellway Crescent, far enough to feel new, close enough to still be hers. The process hadn't required drama or ultimatums, just decision and motion. She had packed what belonged to her and left behind the things that didn't, the grief, the confusion, the expectations she had folded and refolded like worn bedsheets that never felt clean. When Leonard returned home later that evening, he found the living room untouched, the clock still ticking, the curtains still half open. But the air had changed. Her perfume no longer lingered on the couch. Her house slippers were no longer by the door. There was no note, no message, just absence, complete and deliberate. For hours, he sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the empty wardrobe with a quiet hollowness, his phone still locked with no new notifications. Somewhere in his chest, he felt the echo of all the words he'd saved for too long, now useless with no one left to receive them. Cassie had done what he never expected. She didn't beg. She didn't fight. She didn't stay to prove a point. She simply let go, not to escape, but to breathe again. And sometimes that was the most final goodbye of all, the one without noise, the one that didn't even need to be said aloud. Her new apartment was nothing extravagant, but it felt sacred, like a room in which the air agreed with her lungs again. The floors were tiled with cream ceramic, the windows wide and generous with sunlight, and the ceiling fan hummed with a quiet rhythm that made the silence feel companionable. She brought in only what she needed, her books, her favorite kettle, a neatly folded stack of Ankara wrappers, and a framed photo of her mother's old smile. Each morning, she brewed tea in her chipped green mug, the one Leonard never liked, and opened her balcony curtains to let the city's slow waking enter her space. On Sundays, she wore loose cotton gowns and walked barefoot on the tiled floor, savoring the echo of her own movement. She no longer arranged her life around anyone's preferences. She ate what she wanted, slept when she chose, and read aloud to herself when loneliness knocked too loudly. The healing wasn't instant. There were nights she lay awake remembering small things, how Leonard used to tuck his chin into her shoulder, how they once laughed uncontrollably over burnt rice. But she didn't let those memories fool her. They were fragments, not foundations. And now she was building something new, not in rebellion, but in remembrance of who she had been before she dimmed herself to keep someone else comfortable. She bought a potted plant and named it Maybe, as a private reminder that growth was a process, not a performance. Weeks passed, and her name began to circulate more widely in the real estate scene. Carson promoted her formally, making her a team lead for the client acquisition division. Her approach to sales, quietly empathetic, deeply intuitive, had drawn loyal clients who called her not just for houses, but for advice. She found herself mentoring two young women at the firm, both fresh out of university, both unsure of how to find their voices in a world that often confused loudness with leadership. Cassie taught them differently. She told them that being steady didn't mean being soft, and that silence could be strategic when wielded with purpose. During one of their mentoring sessions, one of the girls asked her, "Did you ever go through heartbreak?" Cassie smiled gently and replied, "I went through a whole marriage." The girls laughed, but there was something respectful in the way they looked at her afterward. That evening, she walked home feeling something unfamiliar but welcome, peace that wasn't borrowed or faked. Her apartment welcomed her like a hug she didn't know she'd been missing. She placed her bag down, watered maybe, and sat by the window. The sun was setting softly, spreading golden ribbons across her walls. She whispered a small thank you to the air, not to anyone in particular, just to life, for not ending where it had hurt her the most. Leonard, meanwhile, lived with the consequence of every moment he took for granted. He didn't spiral or sink. Instead, he adjusted in slow, inconvenient ways, realizing too late that the coffee didn't brew itself, that no one would iron his shirts the way she used to, that silence in an empty house wasn't peace, it was punishment. He tried reconnecting with Mira once, but it didn't work. Her voice had changed, or maybe it was his hearing that had grown impatient. The magic they once shared had evaporated the moment he stopped looking at her with the thrill of a man escaping responsibility. He now saw everything differently. The friends who encouraged his distractions no longer called as often. The parties he once enjoyed now felt crowded and hollow. Occasionally, He passed by the street where Cassie's new office was located. He never went in. He just sat in his car, wondering what he would say if he did. But he knew deep down that her peace was no longer a room he had keys to. And that realization, more than guilt, was what humbled him. She had left with grace. He remained with memory. And there was no bargaining with either. Life didn't owe him a second chance just because he finally saw the damage. Sometimes the story didn't circle back. Sometimes the person who walked away stayed gone not out of anger, but out of wisdom. And in Leonard's case, that wisdom now stared back at him every time he opened his door and realized nobody was there to say, "Welcome home." Dear listener, sometimes in life, the most painful revelations don't come through arguments or confrontations. They come quietly, like a moment when the truth knocks and the person answering the door is you. This story wasn't just about a woman who saw her husband with another woman. It was about a woman who saw herself clearly, maybe for the first time in years. Cassie's strength wasn't in what she said. It was in what she chose not to say. She didn't scream, fight, or break plates. She didn't perform her pain for anyone to applaud her recovery. She simply reclaimed her space, one silent boundary at a time. That is courage. That is healing. If you're listening to this and you feel like your voice has been lost in someone else's noise, let this be your reminder. You don't need to stay where love feels like begging. You don't have to explain your worth to anyone who keeps forgetting it. You can start again, on your own terms, in your own time. And if someone has walked away from you or left you bruised by their betrayal, don't rush to fill the void. Sit with yourself. Remember who you were before you twisted your truth to fit someone else's comfort. You are not hard to love. You were just loving someone who didn't know how to hold what was holy. Heal gently, forgive fully, grow quietly, and when the time comes to walk away, let your silence be your closure and your peace be your power. Heavenly Father, thank you for the quiet strength that hides in hearts we often overlook. Thank you for women and men who've been broken in silence but are still standing. For every listener who has ever swallowed pain to keep peace, restore their voice. For every heart that has loved deeply and been disappointed, refill them with wisdom that doesn't need bitterness to be whole. Lord, we ask for discernment, the kind that opens our eyes before our hearts break. Teach us to notice the signs, to trust our intuition, and to never trade our peace for someone else's comfort. Where trust has been shattered, bring healing. Where confidence has been lost, breathe boldness again. Help us to walk away from what no longer grows us. Remind us that leaving doesn't always mean failure, it can mean freedom. That silence is not weakness, it can be sacred. That closure doesn't always come in words, it can come in rest and strength, and knowing we didn't lose them. They lost the version of us that once made them feel seen. For everyone listening right now, I declare peace that passes understanding, grace that surprises them, and doors that open without compromise. May their healing be quiet, deep, and complete. May their next chapter not be a repeat of sorrow, but a rewrite in joy. May they remember this truth. You are still the key. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.